Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club. I'm your moderator for this evening, Brian Hildreth, and I am excited that all of you can be here with us tonight as we dive into next level trusteeship, building an effective and impactful board culture. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, the Trustee Handbook Book Club exists to empower New York's 6,000 plus library trustees with the knowledge and tools you need to excel in your governance role and champion your communities. I know you guys are already doing this for those of you that have been returning back to back for multiple years, but before we jump into it, let's get to know each other a little bit better. Please drop a quick intro into the chat. You can list your name, your library in which you serve, and how long you've been on the library board. It's always fun for us to see where you're all zooming in from. I see a lot of watch parties that are happening across New York State tonight, which is just fantastic. Tonight's session is made possible through our partnership with New York State Library, the Public Library System Directors Organization, the Library Trustee Association, and the Public Library section of NYLA. We're grateful for their continued support in bringing these valuable learning opportunities to trustees all across New York State. So here's our agenda for the evening. First, we'll explore into tonight's topic with expert presenters. Then we'll tackle your pre-submitted questions. Following that, we'll open it up for live Q&A with real-world experiences and your questions always make for the best discussions. Just on a quick tech note, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions and feel free to share your thoughts and experiences in the chat. Supporting us tonight is our ever helpful Laura Chrissy from the Mid-Hudson Library System. She is going to be our technical support and will share out information and links as we go throughout the evening. I'm also pleased to introduce our Trustee Handbook Book Club leader and CEO, Rebecca Smith Aldrich. Rebecca serves as the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System, where she has worked for over 25 years to help the libraries of the Hudson Valley become more viable, visible, and vibrant. Rebecca is the co-author of the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State and the Public Library District Toolkit, which can be found on the New York State Library's website, as well as the author for the newly updated Handbook for New Library Directors of New York State. Congratulations, Rebecca, on getting that done. Rebecca is the co-founder and president of the award-winning Sustainable Libraries Initiative and the principal author of National Climate Action Strategy for Libraries. In addition to her work as an adjunct professor at Long Island University, teaching postgraduate program on public library administration, she is also the author of several books, including Sustainable Thinking, Ensuring Your Library's Future in an Uncertain World, and Resilience, which is part of the American Library Association's Future series. Lastly, our guest speaker, who we're all super excited to hear from tonight, is committed to being committed to being here 11 months ago, so we know he's been coming, is Terry Kirchner. Terry joins us from the Westchester Library System as the Executive Director since January 2009. In his role, he works with 38 independent public libraries in Westchester County to provide professional development and training opportunities for library staff and trustees, to offer administrative support, shared services, and group purchasing to public libraries, and to expand the community engagement of libraries with a focus on the unserved and underserved populations within the county. Previously, he worked at Columbia University and the New York Public Library. Terry is trained as an executive coach, earned his doctorate in human development, has an MBA in industrial and organizational psychology, and has a master's degree in library and science. Rebecca and Terry, now it is your time to shine. We're all excited to learn about next level trusteeship and how to build an effective and impactful board culture. Thanks for being with us tonight, guys.
Brian, thanks for getting us started. As always, we've got a nice turnout tonight, so we know folks are trying to get their 2 hours in under the wire here towards the end of the year. But we are so lucky to have Dr. Terry with us here tonight to talk about next level trusteeship. And I think it really helps pull together a lot of the different concepts we usually talk about here, but in probably a much smarter way than we normally do it. So, Terry, I'm going to turn it right over to you because I think you've got a lot to share with people. They're going to be excited to hear from you. And we'll be here in the background to help out with any questions that come up along the way.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. So let's take a quick look at the agenda. So basically, it's going to be relatively quick on each of these topics, and we can come back and discuss them more after the presentation. But we'll do a quick review of board culture. We'll look at the mission, vision, and values and how they really can guide your creation of the board culture. We'll talk a little bit more about what is an effective and impactful board culture, and then how does board culture actually relate to the overall organizational culture. And then I'll talk just briefly about how we've tried to put some of this in place at the Westchester Library System, WLS, and then a few ideas for how you can sort of keep the momentum going once you get started. Next slide, please. So board culture. Really encourage you to just take a moment here and think, what does board culture mean to you? Like, what would be the key elements that you think in terms of where you are a board member or trustee? What are some of the most important elements of that board culture? Okay, so I actually think that board culture overall is really how you as an entity communicate with each other, how you work as a team, and how you solve problems. That makes it sound pretty simple, right? Basically, it's, engage in open communication, make sure that you stay teamwork focused, and that you always have a problem-solving perspective. Rather than creating problems, you're really focused on solving problems. But I think we all know that somehow it doesn't always work that way. So I think the real question is, what would be the elements that could help you stay focused on these three elements: communication, being team focused, and problem solving? I actually think the answer is in your mission, vision, and values, which is the next slide. So one of the reasons I pick these three is because pretty much all of you have these as a component when you talk about your library, whether it be through your about the library component of the website, or it could be, the strategic plan or long-range plan that you create. These are sort of fundamentals. So the other thing is that if you think about the mission, vision, and values, you really kind of have the context for why your library is the way it is. What is its history? So the mission or the purpose is really the why, right? Like, why do you exist as an organization? And if you haven't read Simon Sinek's book with that very title, Why, it is a classic. I will tell you that there is a quick version that you can also read, and it's basically just a blog posting, and it's one of the resources in the back of the presentation. But one of the things that Simon Sinek talks about is something called the celery test. And basically, we have all been that person who says, I am going to eat better. I'm going to be on a better diet, right? That's my purpose. That's my mission. And then we go in the store and we stock up, we buy some fruits and vegetables. And then you see that bag of potato chips and you debate. And you might decide to get it. And that's okay, as long as you understand that this is a one-off. So mission isn't about being perfect. It's about moving in a direction. So why do you as an organization exist? You exist to move the organization forward in a certain direction. The vision gives you a little bit more concrete understanding of what the mission actually looks like 3 years from now. If we follow the mission and we sort of move forward with certain activities, what would the world look like? Why is it a better place based on the work that we've done? And through all of this, you have your values. And I really encourage you as a board, if you don't have values well, I'm sure you do have values, but if you don't have stated values that exist for you as a board, that you put them in place. Because part of what they do is act as guardrails. The mission and vision can get pretty broad, but if you have the values in place, they can help you keep it much more focused going forward. And I would say, based on some of the economic indicators that suggest we may have difficult financial times over the next 3 to 4 years, it's really important to make sure that your mission, vision, and values are clearly defined so that you as a board can figure out when is it best to say yes and when is it best to say no to different opportunities that will present themselves. Because the one thing is, we often view financial challenges as a negative for very obvious reasons. But I also think we can reframe that conversation and think about what new possibilities does this create for us as an organization? And as you think about sort of the need to do services and the nice to do services that your library is offering, this is the framework that you really want to use as a board because this defines your culture. These are the things that you as a board have said are important for the organization moving forward. And obviously, you would be working with the director and the library staff and perhaps volunteers to make that broader vision of culture happen. But you have to help define it. Next screen, please. So how do we actually know when we're effective and impactful? So part of that is through the mission, vision, and values. If you use those as a framework, they can give you some metrics that the board can measure itself against. So, for example, when you create your long-range plan, you normally indicate that you want to move in a certain direction within the next 3 years. To be an effective and impactful board, you'll want to know occasionally, maybe it's quarterly, from the director and from the staff reports, have we been making progress in this direction? So part of it is sort of knowing what your metric is and then knowing what would be meaningful measures of that metric. It could be anecdotal. It could be stories about the impact that programs have had. It could be quantitative, that we've seen an X% increase. As a board, you really need to think sort of what are some of the short-term goals and what are some of the long-term goals that indicate movement towards the goals that you've put in place. And I do want to stress that we are in a very short-term world, and it's easy to get fixated on short-term results. But libraries are educational institutions. We are in it for the long haul. So we also have to step back and sort of lift up our eyes and see further down the road. So what is a more meaningful metric if we were to think about it for maybe 2 years from now, 3 years from now? And it can be hard as a board member to be patient for a 2 or 3 year result. Obviously there are going to be indicators along the way to show whether or not you're making progress towards that goal. But sometimes the show's not over till the show's over, right? So a slow start doesn't mean a never happening ending. It just means that you had a slow start. And growing up, I was always told it's better to spend more time planning than doing, because if you plan it really well, then you can just do it once. So as a board, you have to kind of think about, what is it that you really want? Do you want just action, or do you really want a thoughtful process that would lead to the action? And there may be a time and place for both of those. I'm not trying to judge one against the other, but it's really kind of understanding where you as a board are now and where you want to go down the road. So the next slide. So sorry for all the text, but I know that we're going to be sharing the slides, and sometimes it's just helpful to have this. As a board, it's really important that you understand the history of your library, sort of how it got to be where it is. The other thing that I really encourage you to do is to recognize that the process of recruiting board members is 24/7. You should always be looking for new recruits for your board. And part of that is that your board and the needs of the board will adjust over time. So having a larger pool of individuals who are potential candidates can really help you identify the right person for that time, whether it be for the next 3 years or the next 5 years, whatever your terms are. You want to do as much as you can to make sure that you have the right fit for where your organization is at that time. I know that sometimes it feels like we're just lucky to get anyone to show up, but that's not really the best way to move your board forward and have it be a truly impactful board. So the other thing is that it's very easy to get fixated on, the board starts at 6 and we're going to be done by 7. You have sort of this, we're here, we're going to work, and we're just going to plow through and do what we got to do. The truth is, as a board, you also set the tone for the organization overall. So it's really important that you as a board have positive, friendly relationships amongst yourselves, that you set the tone. So I encourage you to build in a little social time, whether it be at the beginning of the meeting or maybe it's after the meeting. But part of what you want to do is not make assumptions about what you think you know about the other board members, but really take the time to get to know each other. We all have hidden positive aspects of ourselves that we don't necessarily share with the general public. But with friends or family, they know us a little bit better and they can see our strengths and our perspectives a little bit more honestly. And to be honest, that's kind of what you want to do on the board. You want to understand and to trust your other board mates as much as possible, because together you can then start to ask questions and understand the perspective why this person might be asking that question. The goal at the end of the day is that you are a diverse collection of individuals with multiple perspectives, but coming together to make a unified decision. And, I don't think we want to use federal politics as an example. We don't want that kind of contentious environment. We would much prefer to have an environment where it really is more around consensus, and it's not about always being right, but rather being good listeners and sort of understanding that it's not so much about the immediate decision that's being made, but rather the impact of the decision that's being made and how it relates to the mission, the vision, and the values of this organization going forward. The other thing is really thinking about succession planning in terms of board leadership. We all identify individuals who have certain leadership skills that are very obvious. There are also many quiet leaders. So as a board, it's really important to listen and sort of observe and recognize that there's many different types of leadership that can happen on our board. So there are leadership opportunities within committees. There's leadership opportunities for the full board. There's also, leadership opportunities in terms of task force or other groups where, you might have an initiative where a task force, where it doesn't have to be board members who are leading it, could be ideal. That's also a great way to test the ground for potential board members down the road. So just kind of always think about, tomorrow, right? Who could be the next person to step up as needed? The other thing I just want to highlight is that with boards, to the extent possible, remember that there are separate roles and responsibilities between the director and staff and the board. It can be very easy for boards to slip into, well, we just want to help the director, just want to help the staff do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes your help's not really all that helpful. I hate to say it. So the clear that you can define the roles and make sure that as a board, you're really focused on the higher level fiduciary responsibilities and the higher governance perspectives, and really allow the staff to do the operations. Can't say that enough. So, I mean, I know this is all sort of a rehash of stuff you've heard elsewhere, but I think it's well worth repeating, as is the next slide, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. Public library standards. I know not everybody gets so excited about these, but what I want to just remind every board is that sometimes these are called the minimum standards. I actually think you should think of them as aspirational in the sense that you start from a minimum, but how high can you go? How can you take this general principle and really think about it differently for your library? So the other thing, just want to highlight that if your library is not meeting these public standards, it's going to be very difficult for you to be effective, plain and simple. So if you need a first step in what to do in order to be successful, make sure that you've got these 14 things in place. And once again, these minimum standards, public standards, aspirational standards, these were developed so that depending on the size of your library and the resources that you have available, you can tailor this so that it's a right fit for your library. Don't necessarily compare yourself to your neighbor who might have a much more robust budget or a much larger staff or whatever. These are to help you. These are not to be, a comparison of who's better than whom. The other thing that these really try to do is help you distinguish between what are the functions that are more inward focused, that are really about making sure we have a solid road. And I would say examples would be the bylaws, the policies, things that really help you make sure that you are as functional as you can be, so that you can then look up and focus much more on some of the external community-based operations like programming, meeting community needs, thinking about the type of community report you want to put out there to advocate for who your library is and how you have an impact. This is our opportunity to showcase how libraries are a positive investment in every library or in every community. So the other thing I also want to say is, just as a reminder, when you do your annual report, one of the things that you verify is that you are meeting these minimum standards. So just from a strictly honesty perspective, you really do need to make sure that you're meeting these 14 standards. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, we'll take a little breather here, catch our breath. So we talked about board culture, and that was very specific to the trustees and to a smaller extent to the trustees with the director. The organizational culture is that much broader perspective, and it really looks at all of the key stakeholders within the library itself. So it's the board, it's the director, it's the staff, it's volunteers, it's other core elements that define what the public sees. When they think about the library, they don't necessarily think about the board culture per se. They really think about the organizational culture. But it is the board culture, whether or not you are a positive, cohesive group or in a group that doesn't get along so well, has a lot of tension, that carries through the whole organizational culture. It's hard to remember sometimes that our actions have this chain reaction and impact others. Let's take a look at the other slide. So one of the things you really want to focus on is when we look at all the components that are within our library, what are the common points of agreement? What are the things that we can use as our anchor points to help us move forward? So a successful board, an effective board, will acknowledge that there will be moments where things don't quite, you know, everyone's not fully aligned. And actually, that's a positive, to be perfectly frank. One of the ways we grow is through gentle moments of chaos. So if there are moments where, the board and perhaps the director have one concept and the volunteers and the staff may have a different view of how that's all functioning, this is actually a golden opportunity to have some frank discussions, to really kind of sit down and talk about, well, where are the commonalities that we have? What might be some of the differences? Listening is one of the key components that a board member should have. And it's not just listening, it's active listening. It's when you basically turn your filters off and hear what is really being said. It may not be what you agree with, it may go against what you view, but it's important to understand where others are coming from, what their starting point is. So, this is really true for all of us, but with tonight's focus on boards, on the one hand, you are volunteers, but you are volunteers plus. So it's really important to also remember that a library can only be as strong as its weakest link. So think about, as a board, are you the weakest link, or is there somewhere else in your library that is the weakest link? It doesn't really matter who it is. We're not pointing fingers. But once we know where the weakest link is, we then know that that's the key spot where we need to prioritize some of our activities, because we want to have a higher point where there's I want to call it the lowest common denominator, but you want to raise that to the highest level possible, just because it puts you in a better starting point for all the other work that you're doing. It's very hard sometimes to have a successful one-off project only to then see that it doesn't sustain itself. And part of that's because you haven't built the foundation in order for the sustainability to continue. So we all have limited resources, limited time. So you want to make sure that when you use your resources and time, that it is as impactful and sustainable as possible going forward. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So the other thing, just want to touch base on, is that there are basically two perspectives of organizational culture. So one of it is much more inward focused. And this can be, we need to fix this, we need to do this. It's much more reactive, and it's usually a shorter time frame. And many times this is during moments of crisis. This can also be when you're in a smaller library, perhaps, and you don't have as many resources. You may find that the board is a little bit more engaged in this. But once again, you have to be very careful about that boundary between board roles and responsibilities and the staff roles and responsibilities. The other option is that you can be more outward focused. And this is ideally the place you would like to be more often than not, because this really gives you more of that governance perspective, a higher viewpoint. And you're going to focus more on strategic initiatives, and it allows you to be more proactive. So you can sort of think longer term about where you're going to go. The thing is, with everything, if you do too much of one of these aspects, you could actually throw everything off balance. I have worked with some boards who have been so outward focused that they haven't seen the road, things breaking down underneath their feet. And I've seen other boards where they're so inward focused that they're focusing on a specific process. They don't see, the community and what the community is trying to get from the library. So you have to have a balance of both. But I think it's important to remember that if you're going to move forward, you have to look up and out. That's the only way to really know the direction that you're going to take. From a operational perspective, it is a much more, I would say, well balanced and perhaps a less stressful environment generally when the board can be more outward focused, because it provides more meaning to the work that people are doing. Task-oriented work can feel satisfying in the short term, like, oh, I accomplished something, but it doesn't necessarily add meaning. When you focus more on outward-focused perspectives as a board and you charge your director to lead the staff to do so, that's when people feel more connected to the work they do and the impact that they're having with the community. Okay, next slide. All right. So this is where I can be honest and say it's not that easy to do any of this, because it's not really how we normally operate, but it can be done. And I encourage you to think about doing it in small steps. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that we have done at the Westchester Library System is, with our strategic initiatives, we have 3: promoting equity and access, expanding community member library partner engagement, and updating and improving our infrastructure. When I do the monthly board report, all departments tailor their reports around these initiatives. And it doesn't mean that every board report has, this department has met all 3, but it's really highlighting how the activities that we are doing within WLS help to promote the strategic initiatives that have been identified by the board. And this has actually, it took us a while to kind of get used to this, but it's a great refresher for us as a staff. And it actually gives us more context when we talk to potential vendors or funders, when we talk to employees or individuals that we're looking to hire as employees. It's kind of a great way to talk about the organization. We have basically embodied a lot of these activities as part of our daily work. And it makes it much easier to, when we have to focus inward on fixing a specific activity, we also do it with these strategic initiatives in mind. So it just becomes part of your daily work. And that's really when you feel like, oh, we've actually done this. We'll go to the next slide. And so part of what you're really trying to do is make that board culture become part of the organizational culture. So you're going to do it through, the way that you write your recruitment ads, the way that you conduct your orientations, how you structure your board meetings, how you structure your minutes, but more importantly, also how you build it into your evaluation processes for the director, for the staff, but also for the board. So let's just talk quickly about board evaluation. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is actually what I would encourage every board member to do every year when they have to think about, do I want to serve another year? Your term may be 3 years or 5 years, but I think every year you should do a quick assessment. Am I in the position to be a good board member this year? So ask yourself, why me? What can I bring to the board this year that will make a real difference? Do you still have it in you, right? Is this the right time for me to be in the board? Maybe, last year I had more time. This year I have a bunch of other obligations and I won't be able to commit in the same way. It's not fair to the board or to the organization if you're not there to give your 100%. I also think you have to feel that connection to the library. Do you still have the joy? Do you still feel inspired to bring this forward? And it's okay if you don't. But if you don't, then perhaps you shouldn't be on the board anymore. Let someone else bring their inspiration and their joy to the environment. Next screen. All right. So I just want to say that these questions are not in most board evaluations, so that's why I put them here. But as a reminder, in the trustee handbook, there's a board development section, and it does have some resources that will bring you to evaluation, self-evaluation that boards can do. But I would encourage some of these open-ended questions as well. So an example would be, from my perspective, what are three phrases that best describe this library? And as a board, if you take everybody's answers and you see more negative than positive, or you see certain terms that kind of question how does that fit in with our mission, vision, or values, that's a great moment to sort of pause and think, maybe there's some work we need to do. So let's step back, reassess, see where we can go. Very positive forward thinking, in terms of what do you think will be the most striking difference in our library in 5 years from now? And what's going to be the trend that really takes off and makes things different? Are we prepared for that? The headline one's always fun, right? If someone were going to say something positive about our library, what would I love that to be? If they're going to say something negative about our library, what would that be? Because that means that's something that you need to work on. And then what's our reality check, right? We say we do this. How well do we really do it? These aren't necessarily things that you want to share with the public per se, but I think internally as a document that you as a board could look at once a year, it's sort of a nice self-check just to kind of see, are we overall on track and doing okay? So I'm going to end here. I think, the one thing that I do want to just remind everyone is that, being a board member is a unique position. And, we who depend on library boards really want to thank you for the hard work that you do. I know that it's not always easy, but the work you do has an incredible impact, not only in your local community, but here throughout New York State. So I think for all of us who work with boards, just want to say thank you for what you're doing. So that's it for me.
Terry, thank you so much for putting your unique spin on really important topics. I loved the questions that you had for the board self-evaluation. I think the open-ended question is something sometimes the board evaluations shy away from because the committee is looking for a quick summary of how people are feeling. But that really gets people thinking, which is important in this moment. And I think giving people permission to ask the question, is this still the right volunteer position for me, was a really brave thing to say. So I just want to thank you for putting that out there and giving people permission to reevaluate where they are in their life. Things change. And sometimes when you're wondering why it's such a grind, sometimes because it's you. That's a tough thing sometimes to see. So that was super helpful. Now, I know, Brian, you got some questions for us that came up ahead of time. I just wanted to tell the group that's here today, both Terry is here to answer questions tonight, as well as myself and Brian. Brian's got a few to get us started, but as always, use the question and answer feature to put your questions in, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can tonight. And as always, if we don't get to all of them, we record what we call the after party every year, where we get to all the questions that we couldn't get to at the live event. So those are often cool things to tune into towards the end of the year and get a few more tidbits and those answers across the ages of our series here this year. So, Brian, I'm going to shut the screen down and just really focus on the questions you have for us right now.
Yeah, excellent job, Terry. As you can see, you're getting lots of reactions out there right now. Normally, we get some very nice, heartwarming reactions at the end of Trustee Handbook Book Club, but I think this is one of the first times I've seen it with one of our guest presenters where everybody starts giving you a round of applause before we even get to the end of the show. So this is fantastic. Um, so I know you guys have received these pre-submitted questions ahead of time, so we're just going to jump into them. And then, like Rebecca said, if you guys have more questions, please throw them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So, question number one, how do you know if or when your board is doing the good work?
Well, I think it's easier to know when you're not, right? But I do think part of that is planning ahead. If you don't have a job description for what it means to be a trustee, I would certainly encourage you to draft one or copy one from a library that does, because you have to have a starting point, right, for that conversation. I think the other thing too is to recognize that every year at the beginning of your cycle, your term, I think it's really helpful for boards to talk about, what would we as a board like to accomplish this year, beyond sort of the normal, policies and all that kind of stuff. Is there a certain threshold? Do we want to do some self-evaluations periodically where we talk about our boards, our actual board meetings, right? Do we want to do some evaluation like as a board member, as I sat through this meeting, did it feel like the meeting ran smoothly and effectively? Think about ways that you can sort of build in feedback, right? Because libraries thrive on feedback, right? We do focus groups, we do, community needs assessments and all this. But do we as a board actually embrace that culture and sort of get feedback as part of that process?
I think this just demonstrates that Terry's more human than I am because I immediately like went to like, where's your metrics? Like, so I definitely thought about strategic goals. Like, are they being met? Are you seeing outcomes come out of this organization that are meaningful to your community? Because most likely that means something's going right and hopefully you're contributing to it. But there's other real clear outcomes that you'll see across the year, not just of your strategic goals, but did your vote pass with a healthy margin? People came out, they voted yes, they really believe in what you're doing, they want to reinvest in you. Are you seeing a low turnover in staff, meaning staff are feeling taken care of, their salaries and benefit packages good, it's a good working environment, they really are into what they're doing with the director. As Terry said, are you easily meeting the minimum standards? That's usually, all right, we're in a good place, this is going well. Did you get a clean audit? Did the CPA come back and say, nice job, your internal financial controls are in good space? So as you think through the roles and responsibilities, and Terry said sometimes it's helpful to have those in a written kind of job description. You can find those in the trustee handbook. You can measure yourself against those as well. But there's also like that vibe, right? There's an atmosphere that's created as Terry described in the board culture. And sometimes you kind of know it when you feel it. You're energized going to the meeting, you're seeing things making progress. Your director is excited to tell you, oh, the staff got this done, or oh, hey, look at the response we got from this program. So I think there's like this kind of melange of stuff that like comes together and helps you truly kind of feel it and know it. But there's also those very clear markers in terms of objectives you set for yourself, the audit that you had, the vote results that you're getting, the door count at the library. There's some real clear metrics also that tell you this is going in the right direction.
Yeah, I think we as system directors get the opportunity to see that from like a global view more so than like trustees that are serving, let's just say, in one library. And like Rebecca said, that like, it's not just like one big thing that you should all be doing at the same exact time. It's a lot of the little things that start coming together in small pieces where collectively, once put together, you're like, oh, this we're doing this really good work. And I also think it's important, and this is backing up the social scientist and Terry, is like you really need to give yourself some grace because the trajectory is very different for one library versus another library. And so, you might be coming on as a new board member in this moment of time, and you do see some of the like, I don't want to say toxicity, but like you see some of the things that aren't playing out the way that should be things should be playing out because of your experience on another board or your professional role in some other in job and working with boards. And so you might see some of those things that are playing out where now you're benchmarking with, your other experiences and you're like, well, we're not there yet. But like take the time to focus on, doing some of that internal work, focusing on some of those things that are like reactive that you need to fix. But like as you start seeing progression through that trajectory in terms of like getting tightening things up and getting better at making sure your strategic plans in place, making sure that budgeting is taking place in a very manageable timeline, making sure the director is involved in that process, knowing that you're doing director evaluations, you're doing board self assessments. Like once you start piecing all those things together and you look back on time in terms of like how much that library that you're involved in has evolved, all of a sudden you're like, oh, now we're doing the work. So go back to answer the questions. Now we're doing all the things, and that's kind of how you know that you've arrived. And again, it's a journey. So it's not like you just all of a sudden we're doing all the great things and now we can just give up on it. It's like no. So what's and that's why we have Terry here tonight. It's like so what are the next things we can do to keep this thing moving forward?
And I love that phrase you used, Terry, the gentle moments of
Okay.
chaos, because they're going to happen, right? And it doesn't mean we're off the rails. It might mean we have a misunderstanding or misaligned expectations or something got off track, for whatever reason. That doesn't mean it's over or this board is horrible. Like sometimes it's a funny moment. It's a chance to clarify things, a chance to bring the team back together or to acknowledge something that's not working and course correct it. So just because you might be feeling a little bit of a grind doesn't mean we're horrible, we're not a very good board, right? There's some work to be done in the interpersonal skills or goal setting work that we do, or the director needs a little more support than we realized. And it's really important to acknowledge those on a fast cycle instead of letting it sit there and you kind of steep in it and you're like just getting angrier and angry about how this is going. Like, let's be adults about it, right? Let's speak to each other. Let's say, hey, I think this could be going better. Here's what I'm observing. What are you seeing? And helping course correct those things. Because, when you feel like you're not doing good work, sometimes it's hard to see through those minor irritations or things that sometimes are bigger problems that you've seen but not acknowledged verbally.
Yeah, I think the other thing to remember too is many of our libraries in New York State are over 100 years old, right? So it took 100 years to get to this point. You're not going to fix it within a week. So let's also be realistic about, you know, what the problem is. And, is it something that is a quick fix, or is it something that perhaps we need to do small steps to adjust to get there? Because change is hard. It's hard for the board, it's hard for the director, it's hard for the staff, and it might be hard for the community. So you do have to understand who are the players in whatever decision you're going to make.
So this is a really good segue. And Terry, I think you mentioned this in your strategic priorities for Westchester Library System. Can you provide any advice on how we can diversify our board? Our composition is not representative of our community. We are a school district public library, and trustees are elected by residents of the school district. I love that we've been doing this long enough where now questions are like telling us what library they are, just so that we can tee up the answer a little bit better. That's fantastic.
Well, I'll start and then I'll let you all chime in. So I think first off, it's kind of getting back to that component of always recruiting, right? And it's not easy. Let's be honest. There are certain limits, and some of it is strictly the time allotment that some people have, right? But I also want to encourage us to think about inclusion in a lot of different ways. So each of us is unique and we bring special skill sets and different perspectives. So sometimes there's more visible diversity and inclusion that's evident, and sometimes it's a little bit more hidden. But either way, part of what you want to do as a board is acknowledge, where possible, that there are different perspectives and different viewpoints. And I also think publicly say that we continue to strive for ongoing inclusion, that it's not just a one and done. It's not a fad. This is something that's really built into our culture. And it will happen. It's also hard when your terms just sometimes take a while to allow for some of these changes to happen.
I think it's knowing what you're missing too, right? Like it's easy to become a bit of an insider's club and just kind of keep it going with our friends and understanding A, who might not be at the table, who should be, and kind of mapping your community. And that could be demographically, geographically, skill sets you're missing on that board, something that you're about to attempt as a board, knowing like it'd probably be good if we had someone who, like, oh, that person was on the school board. They did a major building referendum. I bet that'd be super handy to have on the board right now. I think it's understanding who's not at the table first and then creating space for them to arrive. So understanding that for most lay people in your community, and I bet you were at one time that person, it wasn't real clear how do people get on the board. So thinking about what information's on your website about how the board process works. In this case, I think the example, Brian, you gave us was an elected board in a school district setting. That doesn't mean it's the Wild West and you have no control. You can, I saw we have some folks here from the Mahopac Library in my system. They hold an open house, a trustee information session. Hey, have you ever wondered what it takes to get on the board? Come hear from us. So the door's open. Come on in. We'll describe what the job is, how you run for the board, and demystify that process for people so they can perhaps see themselves in that role. And again, it doesn't need to be just passive, right? You can say, I've mapped the community. We're noticing we don't have anyone from the west side of town. We're going to have this information session. I'm going to reach out to a few folks I know over there and say, like, hey, do you have anyone who might be good for this? Because we want to make sure they come over to this information session and start making those connections and building on that great piece of advice Terry gave you of always be recruiting, like always be thinking, but also creating some formal moments where people can connect with that information and actually figure out how they could make it happen for themselves if you're not totally in control of appointing someone to the board.
I think going back to Terry's point of continuous recruiting, I think again, and going back to our first question, if you're constantly doing that work, like you're engaged in an overall process, a lot of if like this person brings out the point that their board doesn't necessarily represent their community, and it's because of like some of the things that you're not if you're not actively recruiting, like Terry and Rebecca just said, if you're out there actively recruiting and you're doing it on a continuous basis, even though you may not necessarily have any folks who are terming out anytime soon, it just means that like you're engaged in that process and people will come to you, but you got to do the active recruitment. We've got our third question, and then we're getting lots of questions rolling in live. So we're going to take two more of our pre-submitted questions, then we're going to go to the live questions. Do you have any recommendations on how a board can ensure trustees are upholding duties and responsibilities? There are always 2 to 3 people who are on the board who are well-intended, but they just don't take it as serious as the other 5 or so trustees. What do you do?
Oh, my. Yes. This is when you're thinking, I'm so glad I'm not board president, right? But but part of it is I do think it's helpful to have occasional, you could call it a board retreat or a check-in opportunity where it's not necessarily a public meeting, but it's more of a reorientation, right? You know, we as a board are going to be focusing on the following things. So let's just clarify what everyone's expected to do and sort of their roles and responsibilities. Look, people are people, right? I also think it's really helpful to, and it could be the board president or someone else on the board, but to have a conversation around what is realistic for each person to do. Because if we're asking them to do things that are above and beyond their capacity, that's not fair to them either, right? I mean, as libraries, we're always trying to build people up and to help them succeed. So let's do that to each other as board members as well.
I love your idea of making expectations clear. You already mentioned the job description for trustees. There's also other things that can help make expectations more clear. And really, this is going on the advice of giving them the benefit of the doubt. Like maybe they just don't quite understand what they're supposed to be doing or what the task at hand is. I know on our board, it's been a great help to have things like we call them our charge statements. What is this committee supposed to be doing and on what timeline? So people understand we're having this conversation now because we're trying to get to this item that has to be done by October 1st, or people better understand the timeline of the work that needs to get done. Our board also created, this was a very good idea, one of our past board members had an annual task list. These are the things that happen every year. We've got to get through these. So we all understand this is the work that's coming this year. And then that helps lay that strong foundation for like kind of like the fun and creative stuff that you're doing to bring your objectives and your goals to life, that really creates that meaningful outcome and work that you want. But without that strong foundation of like the basic administrative stuff has to get done, there's these reports to the state that has to get done. Without a really systematized way to manage that and make sure everyone's on board and understands what we're doing, why we're doing it, it's really hard to have the other maybe higher level conversations that create those magical outcomes that we're all hoping for. And I really liked, Terry, what you said about the retreat. And sometimes it doesn't have to be a full-blown retreat.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you might band together to get your 2 hours in for the state requirement for education, but do so as a group. So we all heard the same thing at the same time. And now we all understand what it's supposed to look like. And if we've got a little faction of the board who's just not on board with that, they're not respecting the task list, they don't get the timeline, and we've all tried to help us all get there, then you're having a board president, right, that has a conversation with those folks like, is this the right fit for you at this time? It seems like maybe you're interested in something else right now, which is not a condemnation. It's just an acknowledgement that as a team, we're trying to move forward in this direction. Do you want to come with us?
I think one of the things that's important to acknowledge too is the critical partnership that's in with the Board of Trustees. So we're talking with trustees tonight as Trustee Handbook Book Club. I know that there's a lot of directors that are joining us here tonight, and I think directors have a big role in this as well. Terry, Rebecca, and I can all speak to this as directors. We work with large number of board members, not only with our member libraries, but also with our own boards that govern us and supervise us. And so, we have a big responsibility or hand in this. I mean, we hear the word orientation or retreat. That's something that the director has to help lead. I don't know about, I've got to imagine Terry and Rebecca, the trustees that hired you, all the trustees that hired you may no longer be trustees for your library system anymore. That became the case for me just a couple of years ago. And so I'm kind of like the legacy person that's carrying on all the traditions of what the board needs to do. And if you have like good policies and procedures in place, a lot of those things happen consistently from one trustee and one board to the other. But as the director, there's a critical partnership there between the board of trustees, making sure that those activities are being carried out so that the way that trustees are coming on the board and the way that trustees are leaving the board after they've served their time is consistent from one trustee to the next. All right. I'm going to get to this one last question. It's another doozy. I think it's important to address, though. How do you address poor trustee behavior in meetings? We have one trustee that likes to debate everything we are doing and will get loud sometimes and shout. They have blurted out four-letter words on occasion. Our board president will talk with them after the meeting when these outbursts happen. It gets better for a couple meetings, but then the behavior reappears. It is toxic and discourages trustees from wanting to be part of the board. We're so glad you're here, Terry. What's your answer to this question?
Gosh darn it. Um, well, um, look, this is never going to be easy, right? So I think part of it is acknowledging that you may have some policies in place already that address this issue. So I'm assuming you have a code of conduct. So the question is, are you as a trustee who is responsible for approving the code of conduct, are you living the code of conduct? So part of it is, I would say, bringing it back to more objective components. So it's not necessarily a personality discussion, but it's really more about here's the ground rules. You as a board member are expected to do the following. I would also check your bylaws just to make sure that you do have an exit clause sort of written in your bylaws. And if you do, make sure you know how to use it. I would basically treat this trustee as a staff member and follow our performance improvement plan. I don't see any reason why you would behave differently. It's a consistent pattern. I always hate to see anyone go, but I also know that sometimes that's the right activity that has to happen. Because at the end of the day, if other library trustees are feeling threatened or just like the environment is toxic, it's not going to bring out the best in the board or in the organizational culture. So.
Terry, can you see my notes? That's this exact thing I was going to say. I liked, I said the exact same thing. Code of ethics or code of conduct, expectation should be clear. Progressive discipline, basically, where the board president has a chat with them. In this example Brian gave, I heard the person say that we've tried that. We've tried talking to them and they keep repeating this behavior. And that means you have to escalate, right? You have to use that opportunity to say to them, like, this is not your party. Like, we are here to do the business of the library. And in order to do this effectively, we're going to need you to play by these rules, which you've been given. We have chatted with you about if this continues to be a problem, here's the consequence. You can give a written warning. You can use Robert's rules. You can suspend them from a meeting or two if like they really just aren't getting it, and working up to that removal clause. So hopefully, as Terry said, it's in your bylaws. But if not, there's also a mechanism in education law to remove a trustee. So, but you have to really follow the rules for that. You're probably going to call your system, your public library system, ask for advice on that. It's very easy to mess up. And that's a very bad headline for everyone. You'd rather fix it internally, help that person understand the issue. And really what's driving that behavior is really important to diagnose as well, to help correct it or to recognize they're never going to change. And this isn't going to work for the group, and we're going to have to handle that, but not allow it to just continue.
Yeah, and I would also say if you're a municipal library, pause also. I would also wonder who nominated that individual to be on the board. And it would just be helpful to understand the political consequences of the action. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying be aware if there's any political issues that might arise. It's better to be forewarned.
All right, so we're going to move into the live questions right now. Terry, this has taken us back to some of your previous slides, so we're going to have to rewind a little bit in time. Paula asked a really good question. She wants to know, when it comes to crafting the mission statement of the organization, how are the director and library staff involved in that, and as it is a responsibility of trustees?
Well, one hopes that they are, right? It's not always the case. But one of the things that I would encourage is that there be an opportunity for everyone to be together, the trustees, the staff, and the director, for a brief facilitated conversation around the mission. I think it would be really helpful if you have an external facilitator who could just kind of come in and help everyone sort of think about this in terms of what does the mission of the library look like, with the understanding that at the end of the day, it is the board that will make the final decision, but it's really wonderful to have as much input as possible. So it can be hard, right? Because the board sort of owns the mission, but the director and the staff make the mission come alive. So it's a shared responsibility. So hopefully it's a shared experience.
How about you, Rebecca?
I thought Terry did a great job answering that one. I don't have much to add to that.
Yeah. Going back to the previous question that we just asked about the behavioral issue with the board member, I think we striked a little bit of a nerve. We got some chat that's lighting up, so I'm glad to that. I'm glad we got that pre-submitted question. Clearly, that is an issue at other libraries across New York State, and that's why we do Trustee Handbook Book Club. What if board meetings are exclusively for the approval of warrants and bank accounts with little or no attempt to discuss larger issues? This is a question asked by one of our anonymous attendees. So it sounds like it's strictly business, but we're not talking about anything else library related.
Well, so I guess on the bright side, you're doing many of the things that you need to do. But I would also say if we were to go back to the minimum standards, one of the things that, especially with this newer version, it really talks about the community engagement aspects, right? Libraries aren't just about transactional moments or about a process. They really are about the level of engagement that a library can have with its community. So I would say at this point, the board is not living up to its full potential or its full responsibility. I also recognize that there may be resources that limit some of the expansion of activities. So I would encourage this board to maybe pick one thing a year and slowly but surely, work towards incorporating different aspects so it doesn't feel so overwhelming.
I had a board that behaved this way once, and we had a lot on that board. We had a lot of long-term people who had just kind of systematized the work. They'd really just like, yep, okay, yep, sounds good. Trust the director. All right, we're done. And they really prided themselves on being out in a half an hour or less. But what was happening was the library was stagnating because the director was kind of left on their own, running on a hamster wheel, just trying to like, I think I understand what they want. I'm going to do this. They didn't say it didn't work out. I'm just going to go over here. And the next thing you knew, like you could see the foundation start to crumble because they were not engaged. They weren't engaged in a planning process or checking in on the planning process or discussing some of the tougher issues that libraries are going to be facing in the future. There was no orientation happening for every once in a while a new person would join them and they would just kind of sit there like a deer in the headlights, like, okay, I guess that just happened. I'm going to go home now. Like they had no idea what their job was. They were lost in a lot of the conversations that did happen. And so Terry made such an eloquent case for what is the culture we're creating. You know, what is that headline that you would hope you're seeing about this library? It's darn efficient. Yes, that's good. But is it effective?
Yeah.
Is it creating the work environment the staff need? Is the director supported in the work they need? Are bring in new folks and new blood to do some of the more challenging things that are coming up in the future? So I feel like there's a number of aspects of that question where I have some questions for them. Are they using committee structure? Because that might, say, oh, there is good conversations happening among some of the board members, and this board is just really tight and they really trust those committee members. Or how long has that director been there? That would be another very kind of diagnosing element to this question. So there's other factors I would want to know a little more about, but it would be, I think, odd to me if that was every single meeting, every single year for multiple years. That would be a sign that this is probably heading for a bad spot.
And it's a balancing act. We've talked about it a lot, just through these discussions that we have here, where, the last thing you want to see is board meetings last for 2.5 hours, and they go on and on and on, and you're kind of going around in circles in terms of what you're talking about, and they're just completely disorganized. I mean, you have to be mindful of people's time in order to retain trustees, but I mean, you also want to make library trusteeship fun. We love doing this work. And I can think of, I know Terry's got a board meeting after this session here, and then I had a board meeting before I came in, and we were kind of talking about that. But one of the things that I love about our board meetings that we've implemented over time is just doing staff presentations. And we had a person from our staff come in and just update trustees for like 15 minutes on the good work that they're doing. And what better way to help trustees connect with the mission than help let them see in like real time what the people are doing, like the how the work is actually impacting the folks within your community. And I think that speaks volumes and goes a long way. But again, it doesn't have to, belabor your board meetings to be 2 hours long. So I think it's a really important balancing act. I think it's great when you can be efficient and get the work done, but at the same exact time, that's why we had Terry here tonight. Like there's higher level conversations that need to be had, and you also have to just connect with the work that your director in partnership with your staff are administering.
There's a dynamic too, I think, for being prepared for future crises. Um, my board has weathered a lot of really tough moments, and it's because they had a really good track record of working together. We were able to figure out how to navigate some really new stuff. And I think if they hadn't spent more quality time together, and I'm not saying manufacture a problem for them to solve, but there's going to be some things to grind on and have conversations about some of the bigger issues of the day that are facing us, whether it's how the library contributes to food security in our community, or what is, the future of AI going to be, or do you folks all understand the pressure we're under on ebook licensing? Like there's some bigger issues at hand that are more complex that having good conversations like that can show this group knows how to speak to each other and can help problem solve together if they've got the context of an issue.
I
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, I got to believe, like, we probably 50% of our trustees at the very least had gone through the pandemic with all of us. I mean, that is it was a horrible time, but it was a great example of how, like, whether board culture was going to actually make you a stronger organization. Because the boards that were doing all this work that we had talked about in the first question, they're ready to go. They're ready to roll up their sleeves and be able to like work with their directors and work with their staff or even work with their volunteers to make sure everybody's needs within the organization are being cared for and taken care of so that they could deliver on mission in a very different way, in a way that was very unfamiliar to all of us. But like for us, I think assistant directors, we did see some of those boards like fall short. Like we saw some of those libraries that really struggled through the pandemic. And that's not to say we all didn't struggle. We all struggled, but like you could definitely see the difference between those boards and directors that had a really good relationship and really good culture, moved through it in a way that was very pragmatic with trying to take as much emotion off the table versus those that just in some ways kind of imploded. So.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is, open meetings law, sometimes I think it's viewed as like an impediment or as an added burden. But I actually think it's a gift in the sense that transparency and trust are two of the best weapons I think any library has, right? Because if you can move forward with these issues and not surprise anybody in the process, then you've really done your job well. And you've created an environment where your community will stand with you, your staff will stand with you, your other board members will stand with you. And I think there's also that question, and you sort of hinted at it, between what should be discussed in a committee and at what level, which is really where that deep and fascinating conversation should happen. And it's okay to ask a million questions, within reason, around that topic to kind of really flesh it out. But when it's brought back to the board, as part of your board culture, you need to respect the work that the committee has done. You do not start to second guess and question all of this stuff. If a committee needs to go back and do more work, that's one thing. But don't basically demoralize and question everything that this committee has done, because that's just not respectful.
We got a question from Peter. How do community values impact the organizational culture?
Well, I definitely would impact. I think the question is, to what extent do the community values really match the professional values? As a library, part of what we want to do is be reflective and respectful of the community. But also remember that as a library, we also try to make sure that people have the ability to have multiple perspectives. So some communities, some community values are much more open-ended and really invite a wide variety. Others are much more normalized and really have a much preferred narrow structure of how things should proceed. I think it's up to each library to kind of find the healthy tension so that there's always a slight push, but not so hard that the community is going to come back at you.
I like this question because I think it reinforces why you see in the minimum standards how often we repeated the phrase community-based plan. That you actually went out there and talked to your neighbors and got a sense of what the community's aspirations are, which should be a reflection of their values. And I think, who speaks for the community is the board. You are representative of your neighbors, and your ability to actively listen to what's going on in the community, what they've identified as needs and aspirations through a really strong planning process is how you then reflect back to them services, programs, partnerships that really make a difference and reflect those values back to them. But I really do want to echo Terry's point about who's defining those values, because just because you're the loudest voice doesn't mean you're speaking for the whole community. And I think it's very important to have good planning processes in place, respecting open meetings law, understanding how to manage public comment period, because just because one or five people don't like what you're doing doesn't mean they speak for everyone. Just as you will struggle to speak for everyone, but you have a charge to make sure what you're doing is based solidly on an understanding of what the community is trying to accomplish for itself.
I think both of you bring up a really good point, particularly like around negativity bias. And we see this when this happens with like service challenges, or again, like Rebecca just said, somebody's not super happy with the service that we provide. It's really easy for trustees to be lured into this idea of like, once we hear one complaint, that's how the entire community feels. And it can revolve around a lot of different types of issues that you deal with in the boardroom. So service challenges certainly are one. Just because the smallest fraction of your community doesn't necessarily agree with your collection management policies and practices doesn't mean that they get to go ahead and take away the First Amendment rights the other 99% of your community. Same can be true around, around funding. Just because the smallest fraction or even, 5% of your community don't necessarily agree with funding the library, it doesn't mean that you don't go forward and put up a funding referendum every single year so that your taxpayers can democratically vote in favor of your library budget and show, that other 5% just how much they support your community. So, we talk about community values, but I do think it's important as we're talking through this that like we recognize, like Rebecca just said, it's not the loudest voice in the community that's getting all the weight because there's a lot of people that you represent that don't have a voice. And so, it's really important that like you're looking out for those individuals because that's something that we have done well, for the most part, well, through our community values since the beginning of time. We've made mistakes, we've had failures, but for the most part, we're always well intended and working to try to get it right. We did talk a little bit about strategic planning through those answers, so I think that's a good segue to Leanne's question. If you have a strategic plan that was written as we came out of the pandemic, and now some of your goals or needs have changed, do you change your strategic plan or just make a new one? I know we're like 4 years out of the pandemic, 5 years
I
out of the
just I
pandemic.
just was counting 1, 2.
Yeah.
You're really probably at a natural pivot point to reassess what's going on in your community. Like for Brian, Terry, and I operate under 5-year plans. We're mandated to have a 5-year plan. It tells us how many years it has to be, which is not a natural cycle. So we pick a midway point, 2.5 years. We go back out there, we reassess. Is this still going in the direction that it needs to be going in? So I would say, right, this question is super easy right now because you're definitely at a pivot point to get back out there, assess what's going on in the community, and adjust as necessary to meet community needs.
One of the things that I try to encourage people to do is to think about having strategic initiatives that are longer term and then realize that your strategic plan is sort of steps to get that initiative moving forward. And this way, it kind of keeps you a little bit focused, but you can start to specialize, in 2 or 3 year chunks.
Nancy asks, what can or should a board do if the executive director no longer works with the board and works more against the board? It's a tough one.
That's where your evaluation process and your progressive improvement plan really come in handy. Hate to say it, but not every group is meant to stay together forever. You know, you certainly hope that there could be a rejoining of forces, but it might not be possible.
I guess I'd ask who's diagnosing that they're working against the board, right? That's a very loaded conversation. And I think we'd want to unpack, is that actually true? Where is that coming from? And understanding, is there a level of frustration because the board hasn't been upholding their end of the bargain as well? We start with the benefit of the doubt that maybe there's some things we don't all fully understand of what's going on. But once we all come to the same understanding, dealing with that behavior in a way that makes it clear, the job here is that we work together to go forward.
I think one of the things that's hard in the library profession is that there's not always a lot of opportunities for lateral movement. So a lot of times people do get trapped. And I do think that having conversations, honest conversations as part of the evaluation process about ways that directors can grow when they stay in a position, and also ways that boards can evolve, right? Sort of what you're saying. It really is growth for both parties, not just for one.
Yeah, and I think consistency too. I think it is a loaded question. I think you can hear a little bit of like, we want to answer the question, but we also, as system directors, we're charged with supporting directors as well as boards. And so that's a thing that we always have to balance. And we are pulled into those situations from time to time. I think both things that Terry and Rebecca touch upon is just this idea of like consistency. So if you're not doing director evaluations on a consistent basis, well, part of that issue is board compliance and doing that director evaluation, but also doing board self-assessment. So like, if you're expecting your director to be on the up and up and doing all of these amazing things and hitting administrative tasks within board meetings, and trying to make as many trustees as possible, are you also individually and collectively as a board putting in the same level of work to make that happen? Because if you're just running on autopilot and making, observations based on your own professional experience, maybe outside outside or in a different field, like for a for-profit setting or something like that, then you really have to like tighten up on your practices, read through the trustee handbook, read through the new library director handbook, and realize like it's a balanced relationship. Everybody has to meet each other somewhere in the middle and be putting the effort. But if you're not putting the effort, that responsibility is on you. So,
Yeah.
um, but I think it's a good question because it is a tough one. Historically, our board did not meet some of the minimum standards. A few of our board members are working really hard to bring us up to speed, mostly on inward activities and reacting to emergent needs. We're burnt out. How do we, to Rebecca's point, survive this chaotic moment trying to course correct for past mistakes? And this comes from an anonymous attendee. I love when people just start using terminology from our presenter slides. That's so awesome.
Wow. I do think kind of going back to the it took you 100 years to get there, you're not going to fix it overnight. I also I'm not so good at it, but I really do think we have to take moments to celebrate, right? It's so easy to get in the grind that it's really hard to step back and truly appreciate how much you've done. So I think to the extent possible, taking a breather, maybe modifying the course of action. So you're moving in the right direction. I mean, I don't know how far behind you are in some of these minimum standards, but maybe you can reprioritize, and maybe there's one or two that you need to focus on versus five. Um, Find some relief mechanisms so that you can also do some more joyous things as part of it.
I think building on Terry's comment about releasing yourself, I don't know, I'm not speaking to everyone in this room, but in my experience, and I've worked with several thousand trustees over the course of my career, they often hold themselves to a very high standard. And sometimes what you need is progress, not perfection, right? Like, let's just get something that's good enough for now. We can come back in
Mhm.
5 years and make that policy even better. But let's just get the basics done, right? And so maybe I'm not saying lower your standards, but I'm saying maybe right size expectations, so that we're not getting lost in, oh, this library over here has this. Like we've got to get that same thing. Maybe not. Maybe, talk to your public library system. They could help you really understand that minimum standard and say, there's actually a template here. Fill this in. You could be done the next meeting with this. So sometimes checking in with a third party who's maybe a little less personally invested in the issue can help you pull back a little bit and come at it in a different way at a different level. But I think Terry's advice is excellent to also take some time to pat yourself on the back for the small things to keep yourself going at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, we get paid to do this work, and all of us work with hundreds of trustees across our systems. And I mean, I'm just inspired every time I'm in the room with a trustee because I've been on boards before. You're a volunteer, you're putting not only like your time into the effort or the mission, but you're also, taking on a little bit of legal and financial responsibility as well as a trustee. And so, like, the fact that you're just doing the work, I think is admirable. I also know from like a very like specific standpoint, like, Terry said, release yourself, focusing on some of the board recruiting aspects of it. Like, so right now, if you're trustees that have been around for a very long time and you're committed to doing the work, but like, you're like, okay, this policy that's in front of me right now, I've reviewed like 7 times. Then it's, there might be a really good opportunity for instead of the focus on being the policy on board retention. So you should get some new folks that are coming in and are a little bit more excited about this work or equally as excited about this work when you first started as a trustee. But as somebody that works in rural libraries for his entire life, like I totally get trustee burnout. And again, just know that you've got public library systems that support you in this work. And regardless of what level, as long as you're well intended and trying to meet those minimum standards, we want to support you and see you all lifted up at the same exact time.
I do feel like we're in one of the rare professions where people really do want you to succeed.
Yeah, I
I got,
noticed actually, guys, I think was it yesterday was High Five a Librarian Day, which is one of my
I miss
favorite
that.
days.
that's why we're getting all these virtual high fives right now. We didn't even know it. Thank you all very much. This is very nice. Um, Do we have any advice for a new trustee that is coming on the board that is obviously having issues between the director and the board? So I'm assuming that this is a new trustee coming on and they're observing the fact that there's friction between the director and the board. How does a new trustee assert themselves or try to help mediate some of that? Well,
I actually think it's a great opportunity, perhaps, for the board and the director to maybe have a little retreat together, because I think it could be just some clarity around roles and expectations, make sure everyone's on the same page. It's always a good starting point. I don't know, Rebecca.
I think as a newer trustee, and I've definitely seen this happen, you may think, oh, I'm the fresh new voice. I'm going to come in and listen to both sides. I'm going to broker this and make this better. That's not your job. You can speak to the board president and say, I'm noticing some tension. Is there a committee in the works? Is the executive committee helping the director kind of do what Terry just mentioned and make sure their expectations are clear, the methodology for evaluation is clear, and maybe you learn a little something about what's going on, or maybe they're like, oh yeah, this is just the way it is, and you can say, well, that's kind of unacceptable. I think we need to do something about that. Or they say, yeah, actually, we've been coaching the director. This process is coming up next. We're going to give you the backstory so you know how to handle the evaluation results when they come in, right? You have to figure out, you don't assume, right? Nothing's in motion about that situation as you come in. But I also think you can be the voice sometimes as a new person when no one's people have just accepted that behavior, and to be like, that's actually really toxic. Like, this is not the experience I'm looking for. So I think we might want to do something about this and figure out a different path forward. You can also be that person, but don't feel like you have to fix it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the advice that we try to give new directors when they're starting out, and I know Rebecca mentions this in the new director handbook, is, don't rock the boat early. Like, your job is just to go in there and be curious and learn as much as possible, kind of observe how things are going, develop relationships with lots of different people. In this case, developing relationships with the director and other trustees, hear their different perspectives, where they're coming from, and just kind of observe. And I think naturally, though, again, everybody's approach is different, but like, I think naturally through that process, I mean, you don't want to wait an entire year to try to like provide some feedback or take some action on a lot of friction that's just making your joy for wanting to do this thing go away. But I think those are the first steps in like months 1, 2, and 3, maybe even 4. But then after that fourth month, it is what based on those relationships that you've created, start having direct conversations either with the director or the board president to say, hey, like, this is there as a new person coming in. I've done the due diligence. I've taken notes. I've talked with all the people. What are some recommended ways of fixing this? And maybe it is a board retreat. Maybe it is a way of just getting outside of the library and, talking about some of the greater, higher level library issues that need to be fixed. And then maybe that gets everybody on the same page. Or maybe it's, there's a lot more deep rooted issues going on there, going back to some of the previous questions that we answered in terms of just like toxicity within the board and a frictional relationship between the director. But I mean, it is a little bit sad to have to say this, but we've been doing this long enough where, like, at some point in time, somebody's got to go. So it's like, if there's so much friction there that, like, it's beyond fixing, arbitration, mediation, whatever you want to call it. At some point in time, it's either the director's going to go on their own will, or the board's going to let the director go, or you're going to see a lot of trustees step away and new trustees come in, and maybe they are a okay fit with that new director. Every situation is just a little bit different. I do want to get to this one. I don't want it to be our last question for the night, but I do think it's important when a question like this is asked, that we address it in the moment that it's asked. How can a trustee protect a director? What are our duties for protecting our director if the director is being harassed? And I'm going to make the assumption that the director is being harassed by another trustee, because I, I'm just going to make that assumption.
Well, once again, I would also encourage you to look at your policies that you currently have in place, because one would hope that well, certainly sexual harassment prevention, but there could be, workplace harassment. There could be other policies that are already in place. And if a trustee is violating those policies, that certainly makes it easier for removal. But I would also encourage, if the director has not followed those policies, have they reported according to the chain of command as it is outlined in those policies? Because once again, these are tough topics and lawyers could get involved. So you just want to make sure that all parties are well represented and understand their rights and obligations as part of this process.
When the question was phrased, the first thing I thought of is that's the wrong way to phrase this. And you will not find a bigger proponent to defend library directors than the three of us. But your job is to protect the library. And
Yeah.
so like it's not about the directors being attacked. That means the library is being attacked. Like that person is creating an environment that could result in a lawsuit by the director who's being harassed. So I think Terry's advice of go right to your policies. What's the process? Has this been documented? Do we have all those things we talked about earlier for holding a trustee accountable for their behavior? That is an absolute deal breaker for me in that situation. You do not tolerate that kind of behavior. You immediately deal with it as the board thought through in that policy and procedure. I don't think it's not about shielding the director. It's about holding people accountable for their behavior, protecting the library's reputation over time. I think that's a very serious issue.
All right, I want to make sure we end on a positive note. We got about 120 seconds left in this webinar. Terry, this very pointed question is to you since you're our special guest. Can you share with us one thing that you would hope our trustees walk away here from this evening to focus on board culture for the greater good of their library?
I think that everything can be reframed as an opportunity. And I think when we sort of take whatever challenges or whatever, even if it's the status quo, I would always encourage us to think, how could we do this differently? And you may or may not do so, but I think it's important to just at least explore that opportunity.
Carrie, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure. I hope you can see from the reactions people are providing through the software and in the chat how much they appreciated what you brought to us tonight. Thank you very much, and good luck at your own board meeting tonight.
Thank you.
And,
Good night, everyone.
and I'll just close this up real quick. First and foremost, yes, Terry, thank you so much. Terry and Rebecca have both been mentors to me as I've worked through this wonderful journey of librarianship. So I always appreciate their time. I always say anytime you're in the room with them or a person like Jerry Nichols, you're always learning. And so I'm glad that you guys could be here with them tonight. I feel blessed to be here with them. We do want to give you a heads up on what 2026 might look like. So we're putting plans in the works right now, but we're looking at 10 possible installments of the Trustee Handbook Book Club, as well as new director handbook book club. So like that's something that we're working on. So there's going to be a lot more installments for 2026. We want to also focus on bringing in more guests from across New York State. So we've had Terry, we've had Kevin Burbisi, and a lot of other great guests over the last 5 years. We've been doing this for 5 years now. I think we're at 29 installments, and so by the end of next year we'll be at 39 installments, and then also potentially taking this thing on the road. So look for us maybe potentially late 2026, early 2027. You might see Trustee Handbook Book Club come to a community library near you, and we would hope you would join us live as well as bring us all our participants in online as well. But at the end of the day, if you're looking for any more of our past installments, go to midhudson.org/trustee book club. We love you guys so much. Thank you so much for being here, supporting us over all these years. We couldn't do it without you. Like we said, we get paid to do this work, but you guys do it for free and you do an amazing job. Thank you so much for leading our public libraries across New York State. It is such a great place and time to be working with all of you here. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you in 2026.
Bye.